Let's examine this idea that narcissists hurt with intent and strategy, not confusion, not emotional clumsiness, but deliberate calculation. That's uncomfortable for people to hear because it removes the comfort of rationalizing bad behavior as accidental. It strips away the illusion that maybe, just maybe, if you were clearer, kinder, quieter, more patient, you could have prevented it. But you need to confront this. There are people, fully grown, intelligent, articulate individuals who know exactly what they are doing when they cause harm. Not because they're emotionally overwhelmed, not because they're just bad at relationships. No, they hurt because it serves a purpose. There is an architecture to their cruelty. And it often begins with seduction. Not romantic seduction necessarily, but psychological seduction, the creation of a mirror. They reflect back to you the best version of yourself, your humor, your values, your dreams. It feels electric because they've done the work to figure out what you want to see. And when you believe you found someone who finally sees you, you begin to trust, you begin to give. That's when the switch occurs, slowly. Strategically, testing boundaries, withholding affection, rewriting reality. And every moment of confusion you feel, that's not an accident, that's the plan. Because if you're confused, you're easier to manipulate. If you're doubting yourself, you're more likely to seek their approval. If you feel off balance, you reach for the one thing that used to feel like solid ground, them. It's a psychological loop they build carefully, like an engineer constructing a trap. And why? Why would someone do this? Because for people like this, the feeling of control is more important than love, more important than connection, more important than truth. The dynamic is not about mutual growth. It's about dominance masked as intimacy. It's about feeding an identity that cannot hold itself up without someone else beneath it. So when they hurt you, when they dismiss, belittle, betray, lie, it's not random. It's not a bad day. It's not because of their childhood or their stress or your tone. It's part of a pattern designed to test the strength of the leash. Because every time you stay, they learn something. Every time you rationalize, they gain something. And every time you shrink yourself to avoid triggering their rage, they win something. If you don't grasp this, you stay vulnerable to it, not just from one person, but from anyone who operates this way. You must see it clearly, not to become bitter, but to become armed with truth. And the truth is this: some people wound others strategically to secure their own fragile sense of superiority. And it is your job, not theirs, to recognize that strategy for what it is. Because the longer you explain it away as an accident, the longer you remain trapped inside a game you never agreed to play. And that's not compassion, that's self-abandonment. Let's unpack something dark but essential. Your pain in the hands of a narcissist isn't ignored, it's observed. But more disturbingly, it's measured, not with empathy, not with concern, with calculation. See, there's this false idea that the narcissist is unaware of the damage they cause, that if only they understood how much you were hurting, they'd change. That idea is seductive. It keeps you hoping to keep you waiting. But it is fundamentally incorrect. The narcissist watches you. They observe the tears, the hesitation in your voice, the way you withdraw or the way you over-explain. They see the emotional cost. But instead of treating that pain as something to be avoided or healed, they use it as evidence that what they're doing is working, that you're still tied to them, that they still have access to the emotional levers that control your reality. This is hard to accept because it challenges your moral framework. Most people operate on the assumption that others are like them, that pain matters, that suffering evokes compassion. But narcissists, particularly the manipulative and covert types, function under a different psychological blueprint. They don't see pain as something inherently wrong. They see it as useful. When you hurt, and they know it, they derive validation. Why? Because it confirms they still have power. If you're broken, it proves they mattered. If you're pleading for clarity or closure, it affirms that they're still at the center of your internal world. And that control is intoxicating to them. They don't need your respect. They don't need your love. What they crave is the ability to provoke a response. If you're emotionally activated, angry, devastated, confused, they feel dominant. In a warped way, it reassures them that they exist. Now, this is where the trap sets in. You, being a conscientious and emotionally open person, believe that your vulnerability will build intimacy. You think that if you show them your wounds, they'll stop cutting. But to a narcissist, your vulnerability is a map. It shows them where to press harder next time. And when you come back after all the damage, they don't interpret that as love. They interpret it as submission. They don't think, wow, this person really cares about me. They think, I can push them this far and they'll still stay. And that becomes the metric. Your suffering becomes data in their internal calculus of control. So what do you do with this knowledge? You must stop thinking your pain will educate them. It won't. It will only embolden them. Instead, you have to use your pain to educate yourself. Your emotional suffering must become your evidence, not of their value, but of their impact. And that shift changes everything. Because once you stop offering your pain as a plea and start treating it as a signal to exit, you begin to dismantle their control. And that, finally, is when real healing begins. Let's make something very clear, something people often confuse when trying to make sense of toxic or narcissistic behavior. You've probably said to yourself at some point, maybe they just don't get it. Maybe if I explain it differently, if I stay calm, if I appeal to their better nature, they'll finally understand. But here's the problem with that line of thinking. It assumes the issue is a lack of comprehension. It assumes they're simply unaware, emotionally uneducated, maybe a little damaged, but reachable. That's comforting, but it's wrong. You're not dealing with someone who doesn't understand. You're dealing with someone who doesn't care, and more specifically, someone who actively rejects accountability. That's the real root. They understand perfectly well when they interrupt you, minimize your needs, twist your words, disappear when you're vulnerable, and then return when they sense you've regained a bit of strength. These aren't unconscious missteps. These are patterns, rehearsed, refined, repeated. They comprehend how their behavior affects you. You can see it in how they adjust their tone when they want something, how they suddenly become attentive when they sense you're slipping away. That kind of selective behavior doesn't come from ignorance, it comes from intention. What they lack isn't knowledge, it's empathy, the capacity to feel with you, the willingness to step into your shoes and care about what they find there. That's what's missing. And right beside that gap sits the deeper problem. The total absence of accountability. They don't just avoid responsibility, they see it as an attack. To admit fault for them is to lose dominance. To reflect, to apologize sincerely, to change, they interpret these acts as weakness, not strength. But when you confront them, even gently, you don't get introspection, you get deflection, defensiveness, or manipulation. They'll turn the conversation into an indictment of your tone, your timing, your flaws. They're masters at rerouting truth to preserve ego. Here's what that means for you. You're not going to logic them into growth. You're not going to love them into awareness, because at the core of their psychology is not a lack of intelligence, but a refusal to relate, a refusal to take ownership of harm done. This is why you walk away from conversations feeling more confused, more blamed, more exhausted. You've entered a loop where you're the only one playing by the rules of emotional maturity. And every time you try to pull them up, they simply reinforce the very ground they're standing on. Power without responsibility. So don't waste your energy asking, why won't they understand? Start asking, why do I keep hoping? Understanding will lead to accountability, because it won't, not with someone who's committed to evasion as a way of life. You're not desperately young. You don't need their agreement to make your pain valid. You don't need their permission to hold them responsible. Your clarity is enough. But it only becomes power the moment you stop begging for recognition and start choosing self-respect. Emotional manipulation is not chaotic, it's not random, it's systematic, and it feeds on two very specific traits: your loyalty and your silence. Now, loyalty in its proper form is a virtue. It's what makes long-term relationships possible. It's what keeps families together, builds trust, and anchors society. But like all virtues, loyalty becomes dangerous when it's exploited, when it's demanded without reciprocity or used as a leash rather than a bond. Manipulators understand this. They spot loyalty in you the way a predator spots vulnerability in prey. They test it early. A small betrayal here, a minor boundary pushed there, and they watch how you respond. If you excuse it, if you justify it, if you internalize it, they've learned something very important. You will stay silent to protect the connection. And that's all they need. Because once you've shown that your loyalty is unconditional, they begin to reframe it, not as a shared value, but as a weapon. They turn it against you. They'll say things like, I thought you were different, or you're just going to walk away like everyone else. And so you stay, you work harder, you absorb more blame, not because you're weak, but because you're trying to be good, because you believe that loyalty means endurance, silence means maturity, that conflict means failure. But that's a lie. Silence in the face of mistreatment isn't virtue, it's consent. And manipulators depend on that consent. They rely on the fact that you'll prioritize peace over truth, that you'll internalize problems to avoid making them worse, that you'll keep the mask on because ripping it off would mean facing the fact that the person you trusted is not who you thought they were. So your silence becomes the soil in which their power grows. Every time you swallow your voice to keep the peace, they gain ground. Every time you choose not to speak, they choose to escalate. And before long, you're not in a relationship anymore. You're in a psychological economy where your value is measured by how much pain you're willing to tolerate without protest. And here's the crucial distinction. Emotional manipulation doesn't survive confrontation, it survives avoidance. The moment you begin to speak clearly, calmly, consistently, you disrupt the system. Because you're no longer responding in the way they predicted. You're no longer giving them the loyalty they haven't earned. You're no longer offering silence as a sign of love. That shift is terrifying to them because it signals that you're waking up, that their control is weakening, that the game is no longer working. And so the question you have to ask yourself is this: am I being loyal to the relationship or disloyal to myself? Because if your silence is costing you your self-respect, your mental health, and your reality, then it's not silence. It's self-abandonment. And no one, no matter how wounded, charming, or complicated, has the right to ask that of you. Forgiveness is one of the highest virtues a human being can practice. It requires strength, self-awareness, and compassion. But like all virtues, it becomes corrosive when it's applied indiscriminately, when it's stripped of discernment, stripped of boundaries, and handed out reflexively in response to behavior that has not changed. This is precisely where so many people fall into the trap of toxic dynamics, especially with narcissists and emotional manipulators. Because here's the truth that's hard to digest. Forgiveness without boundaries does not reform the narcissist. It reinforces them. Solemn, you think your forgiveness is a bridge to healing, that it shows maturity, that it keeps the peace. But to someone who exploits, lies, and dominates others emotionally, your forgiveness isn't interpreted as grace. It's interpreted as weakness, as a green light, as permission. They don't see your ability to forgive as a sign of depth. They see it as a sign that they can get away with it again. Understand this, in a relationship with someone committed to growth, forgiveness is transformational. But in a relationship with someone committed to control, forgiveness is fuel. It feeds the cycle, it resets the pattern. It signals that the damage can be done again, and you'll still be there afterward, offering clean slates and soft words. So what happens? You forgive the silent treatment, the gaslighting, the betrayal, not once, but over and over. And every time you convince yourself that this is what love is supposed to be, difficult, messy, sacrificial. But that's not love. That's rescue behavior. That's emotional codependency dressed up as compassion. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, must be paired with boundaries. Otherwise, you're not healing anything. You're enabling it. Boundaries say, I will not hate you, but I will not allow you to hurt me again. Boundaries say, I release this for my peace, but I remove access until your behavior changes. And this is the part many people avoid, because boundaries come with consequences. They might leave, they might blame you, they might escalate, but that is not your problem to solve. That is the natural reaction of someone losing control over a person they thought they owned. A boundary is not punishment, it's clarity, and it's the only thing that disrupts the cycle of manipulation. Not lectures, not begging, not tears, boundaries. You teach people how to treat you by what you allow after they've hurt you. And when you give unconditional access to someone who has proven they will use it to cause harm, you're not forgiving them, you're abandoning yourself. So the next time you think about offering forgiveness, ask yourself, am I forgiving to free myself, or am I forgiving to keep them from leaving? Because if your forgiveness keeps delivering you back into harm, it's not grace, it's surrender. And some cycles only end when you stop turning the wheel. People often mistake return for redemption. They believe that when someone who has hurt them comes back, it must mean something. Maybe they've finally realized what they lost. Maybe they've changed. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But let me tell you something that's as difficult as it is necessary to accept. When a narcissist or emotional manipulator returns, it is rarely about love. It is about testing control. This kind of person doesn't operate on the same emotional logic as you do. They don't return because they've done soul searching. They don't come back because they miss you in the way you miss them. They return because they want to know, do I still have access to you? Do I still matter enough to pull your attention, to extract your energy, to watch you react? It's not love they're looking for, it's relevance. And the surest way to feel relevant, to feel powerful, is to know they can still affect you. So they reappear, not with apologies rooted in accountability, but with vague sentiments. I've been thinking about you. I miss us. Can we talk? And those words, for someone who's still healing, still hoping, still unresolved, they cut through all logic. They bypass the rational mind and hit you straight in the heart. Because we're wired to believe in second chances. We're conditioned to believe that people grow. And sometimes they do, but manipulators come back not to grow with you, but to reset the loop, to see if they still own the keys to your emotional world, to verify whether your boundaries were real or just temporary threats. And if you let them back in too quickly, without change, without proof, without real accountability, they learn something vital. The door is always open, and the cycle continues. You have to understand the psychological reward they get from re-entering your life. It isn't always about cruelty. Sometimes it's about reassurance for them, reassurance that they still have power, that their absence created a vacuum, that their presence still determines your emotional climate. So ask yourself, when they return, are they truly returning to repair, or are they returning to reaffirm dominance? Because love takes responsibility. Love listens. Love makes amends and changes behavior. But control makes promises without action. Control triggers guilt. Control plays the part, but never rewrites the script. And here's where your agency becomes essential. You don't owe access to someone simply because they knock again. You don't owe conversation to someone who used your openness against you. And you certainly don't owe belief to words that come unaccompanied by action. You owe yourself the truth. And the truth is, not everyone who returns deserves to stay. Some people come back only to see if you've fallen asleep again. And the most powerful thing you can do is show them that you haven't. There's a deeply embedded idea, one that traps countless people in cycles of waiting, hoping, and self-abandonment. It's the belief that healing requires an apology, that closure depends on the person who caused the damage finally recognizing what they did, that your peace is held hostage by their willingness to confess. But let's confront that directly. You do not need their apology to reclaim your power, and in many cases you will never get one. Not because you don't deserve it, but because people who manipulate, abuse, or exploit rarely apologize with sincerity. Why would they? A true apology would require them to acknowledge harm, and with that, responsibility, accountability, and the loss of control. And for a narcissist or emotion manipulative person, that's intolerable. To apologize is to level the playing field. To admit they were wrong is to surrender the very control they built the relationship around. So they don't do it. Or if they do, it's shallow, strategic, meant to lure you back in, not to repair anything real. What do you do with that? You stop waiting. You stop sitting at the emotional dock hoping a ship called closure arrives with their name on it, because that ship is not coming. And the longer you wait, the more you give them precisely what they want, control over your state of mind. Reclaiming your power means understanding that your healing is your responsibility, not theirs, yours. It doesn't mean letting them off the hook. It doesn't mean denying what happened. It means taking back authorship of your narrative. It means deciding consciously, I will not let the person who broke me be the one who decides when I get to feel whole again. The real tragedy isn't the absence of an apology. It's when someone spends years waiting for it, living in pause, thinking, if they just understood what they did, then I could move on. If they just said the words, I could feel validated. But that kind of healing is conditional and therefore unstable. It rests on the emotional maturity of someone who has already proven they lack it. Power returns the moment you stop needing them to do the right thing. You define your worth, you name the truth, you process the pain, and then you decide they don't get to have the final word. That's your job now. Let them carry the weight of unspoken guilt. Let them sit with the silence of a truth they refuse to own. You don't need their voice to validate your experience. You don't need their confession to step out of the fog. You just need to stop handing your future to the person who broke your past. That is power. Quiet, undeniable, yours. So what do you do now? Standing on the other side of all this knowledge, you choose clarity over illusion. You stop negotiating with manipulation. You let go of the hope that the person who hurt you will be the one to heal you. That isn't their role anymore. Maybe it never was. You reclaim your standards. You define your peace. You start asking not why did they do this, but why did I stay silent in the face of it? Not to blame yourself, but to take responsibility for where you go from here. Because freedom begins the moment you stop asking them to see you and start seeing yourself. You don't have to explain your boundaries to those who never respected them. You don't have to shrink your voice to keep someone else comfortable. You are not here to be reshaped by someone else's damage. The apology may never come, the validation may never be given, but your power, that returns the moment you stop waiting and start choosing. Choose truth, choose limits, choose self-respect, and walk on.